OK, so there's no real argument with Treasury and no problem with how they've dealt with any of this, Fran, and yet they have a very different point of view.
Yeah, no real problem with Treasury, but Treasury clearly had a problem with the Coalition's numbers, and it was just a difference of opinion, according to the Coalition. But, you know, there's some real problems in that costings thing. There's some real problems. But that in itself, I agree with them. I think when the independents say it's not a game breaker, I think they meant it. What it's about is the shenanigans around it. And what this whole thing is about, and I think that's what the Wilkie thing goes to, is these guys are trying to get a sense... Tony Windsor said it the other day on the radio, about who they can trust in terms of trying to make this parliament work. Because it's going to be about trust in the relationship.
Just have a listen to this from Tony Abbott and see whether you think it makes any difference. This is what he had to say about the costings.
There are a whole lot of issues in play here, and at times arcane argument about costings is by no means the most important.
Now, David, the independents themselves put this at the top of the list right at the outset, and then Tony Abbott says it's an arcane argument. That wouldn't play all that well, would it?
Play terribly badly. There's no way that the opposition can justify the mistakes and the assumptions they made. If they were really talking, if they really seriously were putting up costings before the elections, which were on a different basis to the costings of the government, they had to say so. They had to say, look, this is an apples and oranges situation here, ladies and gentlemen. They never did. The mistakes, some of the mistakes are kindergarten mistakes, and indeed were pointed out before the poll itself. But this is a huge hole in their credibility, David, going to the elections.
How much credibility, speaking of credibility, do we put on Treasury, though, given that, I mean, this was the mob that brought us the mining tax revenue estimates, which were wrong by half.
That's true, but you've got to be a part of a process. It was the process that the Coalition brought in itself. I mean, it's the process we're meant to trust. Now, yes, Treasury makes mistakes, but it makes mistakes for everybody on the same set of assumptions.
These are also the public servants who are facing the possibility that the people that they are docking publicly for being about $10 billion out in their costings might, on about Tuesday of next week, be leading the government.
But you see,
so that it's not something that they would do lightly.
But you pick up the newspapers and
you can't just dismiss Treasury. You can't just dismiss it.
No, and the respective newspapers have got their own individual commentators. So the split in opinion is extraordinary. You see Laura Tingle writing in the Financial Review saying the costings make Abbott unfit to govern, which is a big call. And you've got Michael Stutchbury writing in The Australian who says there's no big hole, there's no gaping hole, there's potholes. You know?
Yeah, that's true.
You might have noticed, I don't know, you might have noticed a certain keenness on the part of The Australian to see Tony Abbott elected. I put it no higher than that, just a certain temperamental keenness.
But I think you can argue about the dollars, and even Treasury says, look, it could be 4 billion black hole, it could be 11 billion, whatever the differences is. But I think if you read Laura Tingle's article, it was about the attitude to the detail and the attitude to accountability. And Tony Abbott saying an arcane argument about costings, probably a lot of voters go, yeah, I'm sick of the arcane argument.
Well, exactly.
But the truth is, it is the economy, and you can't dismiss it.
But the other point here is that we're dealing with out years so far ahead that the figures become rendered basically meaningless on both sides.
So therefore it goes to accountability capacity.
But
are you, for instance, counting the selling of Medibank Private and then forgetting to count in the fact that you're also not getting the dividends from Medibank Private? That's pretty basic
but in the hothouse atmosphere of an election
immediate.
campaign, it's not unusual, put it that way, for either side to kind of chance their arms a bit in the costings.
Sure.
Because they expect you'll either win or lose. And then you'll deal with it. They don't expect a draw.
No, that's
and
right.
that's what happened this time.
So all the dirty laundry's out.
And suddenly, in this sort of 2 or 3 week period, there's a very close examination of it. The Andrew Wilkie deal, right? He announced his support, and then, of course, dropped this little gem into the conversation.
Mr. Abbott made a number of commitments to me to get my support, some of which were very generous. For instance, Mr. Abbott offered $1 billion to Tasmania to build a new hospital. The ALP was not going to give me $1 billion because it would have had to completely go outside proper process to do that.
Did you not trick Mr. Abbott by, putting this pressure on him to help you out with this hospital?
I would hardly call going through a process of negotiation tricking someone.
No, but then again, if you raise the issue that it would cost around $1 billion, there's a nice round figure, to build a hospital in Hobart, and so then they offer it, is that entrapment?
Well, I don't know whether it was entrapment, but he certainly used the offer in the end game to build on the costings
Yes.
debate to try and put a nail in Tony Abbott's economic credentials. In other words, Tony Abbott was profligate, the government was more constrained. I'm going with the more constrained option. But the other thing to point out is that this is Andrew Wilkie. He was a whistleblower on the Iraq War. He stood against John Howard in Bennelong. I mean, he has been looking for the day of reckoning with the coalition for a long time. Tony Abbott was part of that government that he thinks mistreated him. And, he got it in the neck this week.
Well, so it might have been a calculated move on his part to draw them in?
No, I can't believe it was a calculated move like that. But I think it goes to the overall thing that, and, Annabelle Crabb dubbed Tony Abbott people skills, and what's on show here is why he's got that nickname, because going back to the Tony Windsor thing and the costing, it's about trust. With Wilkie, he may not have known it when he said he wanted a new hospital, but what he's trying to decide is a sense of who's going to run a better government. So it's about not just the individual offers, but the atmospherics around that.
So why put up $1 billion, though?
Well,
he said, I want a new hospital, talk me through it.
Because,
what do you reckon?
this I think is what happened. He wants a new hospital. Everybody agrees a new hospital is going to cost about $1 billion. What Abbott did was say, here it is, up front, now. And what Wilkie thought...
Yes, but that wasn't Abbott's fault.
But
Wilkie asked.
But Wilkie wants a new hospital.
Yes.
But as I understand it, his objection to what then happened was that Abbott said, here it is, straight away, all at once, and we'll find a way to do it. Whereas what Wilkie wants is, yes, eventually he wants a new hospital, and eventually that's about what it's going to cost. But what his argument is that it should happen by due process. You don't need $1 billion up front, and in God's name, where is that $1 billion going to come from? Now, that is not somebody going into the negotiations and saying, I want $1 billion. OK, you can have $1 billion, and then going out and laughing at them for being offered $1 billion. It is more complex.
No, but then afterwards, just have a look. Just before you go on Radio National with your interview, friend, you had Andrew Wilkie on the phone, and Joe Hockey was sitting there listening to it all. Here it is.
It will come through a process that will free up $1.8 billion nationally. So this is very much not pork barrelling for Hobart. I've managed to bring that next round of health and hospital funding forward.
You failed to explain where the $1 billion you came back to offer actually came from, how it would be funded. Therefore, what he was judging there was the alternative government and how you would manage.
Sure, he didn't ask.
He didn't ask
where the money was coming from.
So he had no obligation to explain where the money was coming from because Andrew Wilkie didn't ask.
No.
But also, maybe Andrew Wilkie was doing a bit of justification after the act because he's perhaps uncomfortable with the idea of himself as a pork barreller too. So he took the least bad pork barrelling.
And Paul Kelly came up with this wonderful expression in the Oz yesterday. We called it ethical pork barrelling. He was laughing at it as ethical pork barrelling.
So, but this is an interesting precedent, you see. What's going to happen here clearly is we're going to have a bunch of independents who are going to want less money than more money whenever it comes to pork barrelling. That's
remember that a mere $700 million or something that Queensland got during the campaign very early on for a road project, and the Telegraph ran the headline, ALP to New South Wales dropped dead.
Yes.
I would have thought this was a good opportunity for them to run another one. Coalition to New South Wales dropped dead because they're offering $1 billion for a hospital in Hobart and nothing to New South Wales.
But I agree with Fran. I mean, I hate the word atmospherics, but I hate the word atmospherics, but this does not look like a government in waiting, negotiating with independents. And taken together with Abbott's wild rhetoric in his open letter to the independents that's been published this morning, this does not look and feel like a government. Whereas Gillard, who didn't look much like a Prime Minister often during the election campaign, has in the last fortnight looked and behaved as more like a Prime Minister than she ever has in her brief Prime Ministerial career.
She's understood her audience, are the independents, and not the public at large, whereas I don't think Tony Abbott ever got his head around that.
No, well, he's still, that's what I mean by he's still in election mode. I mean, he's still beefing up the threats and the fears. And I mean, the audience this morning, I mean, I'm sorry, Barry, but there's only 3 people watching that count this morning when Nicola Roxon was interviewed by you, and that's the independents. And she was pitching herself really narrowcast to those people.
But they
and
couldn't
Tony's
have been clearer at the beginning of this negotiation. Rob Oakeshott came up with the notion of the new paradigm. They laid it out there, and they don't want to hear that old-style rhetoric. They've finished with that. They want a different approach.
Now, can they do a whole lot on the poker machines, or is that still pretty much the responsibility of the states? They've made promises, but still don't they need the states to come on board?
With all due respect, I mean, the poker machines is, it's a terrible problem for problem gamblers, but there's only 95,000 of them in Australia. I mean,
but that's all this promise is about.
By world standards, that's huge.
But the real problem is, ordinary people like us who put the money through the pokies. If you want to get hold of the problem, the revenue that's going to poker machines, it's us you've got to worry about.
No, but that's not the real problem. And I don't think people like Xenophon think that's the real problem either. They're not saying you can't have a flutter. Right. They're saying that it wrecks some lives. I mean, I've known lives. But I'm saying the
volume of betting, which is the problem. The amount of money that's dedicated to this dead-end process is ordinary people, not the problem gamblers.
But Barry's point is the tricky technical point, which is whether there is any kind of constitutional leverage that Canberra has to fix up.
Well, there is.
And there is apparently, through the corporation's power, some kind of leverage. But we know how big a problem this is by the squeals we've heard in the last week from both the clubs who make these fortunes and the state governments who live off them.
See, Kevin Rudd promised, remember, to wage war on pokies. He promised that before the last election, before the 2007 election. He didn't move it.
He had too much going on.
I keep saying that. He took it into COAG, I think, and it got bogged down. And I think the real thing is, if you're trying to resolve it with the states coming on board, you're going to have to offer them a whole lot of money because of the black hole it's going to put in their finances.
It's just delicious, though, to watch all these problems that have been sitting there for so long that nobody's bothered to deal with. Now they're finally getting done.
Of course,
I think that's great.
But don't forget, Nick Xenophon was elected as a senator from South Australia, largely on the fixing up the poker machines issue. It is actually a big issue with the community, and one of the things that's been emerging in the last 10 days are all sorts of issues that don't particularly interest the party bosses of the Liberals and Labor.
Or the marginal seats.
Or the marginal seats, but do intensely interest the community, and the independents are bringing these to the fore. It's been the most wonderful process, the longest audition for a musical in the history of Broadway, but it's been a wonderful process.
Mind you, I mean, the whole process too is throwing up bizarre ideas that are suddenly at the centre of national debate, like Bob Katter's talking about the spread of, human disease through flying foxes. I mean, these things have got to be, ranked in some order of importance.
He's also talking wonderfully about turning the rivers inland, and whenever I hear him say that about turning the rivers inland, I think he should also be talking about the notion of a last expedition to find Lassiter's lost reef, because that should be on the cards.
But and a lot of the issues he puts up, the tariff wars, no party is going to come to that, and he understands that. But there are some issues that he has, for instance, bridges with the Greens on, the whole biosecurity, the whole sort of keeping out the foreign bananas under the issue of biosecurity. The Greens are right there with him.